Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the connection between one's relationship to nature and the world, and then how that relates to conservation, as well as the role of psychedelics such as ayahuasca and how they work into that interchange. So I'm interested in the perspective-shifting value of psychedelics and schools of thought in anthropology and social science that are informed by those plants and those compounds, which challenge the nature-culture dichotomy of modernity, by which so many of us separate ourselves from nature and instead treating the environment as a network of subjective selves with agency with which we relate. So, as you all know, Amazonian shamanic traditions involving the ingestion of psychedelic plants often produce valuable biomedical resources, and the West benefits from ethnopharmacological discoveries generated by the very societies whose subjective experiences are dismissed and whose environment is degraded. The resulting interplay between ontology, conservation, and visionary plant use has implications for how we as humans adapt to cultural environmental change. A proper exploration of the nature-culture dichotomy, viewing forests as living networks, and a better understanding of indigenous traditions ensures the protection of in situ resources of biocultural diversity and ecological knowledge. So I've been very intrigued by the notion proposed by philosopher Charles Peirce and Eduardo Kohn, who expanded upon it in this book. The idea that all life is semiotic. In other words, all living things are minds that deploy and interpret signs. And this sign use is what we mean when we say think. In other words, the world is mind, or mind manifesting. And engaging with this psychedelic point of view has enormous potential for ethnography and science in general. I just finished my fieldwork for my master's in Peru. I spent 3 months in central Peru between the Andes and the Amazon basin with a group called the Yanesha, as well as the Ashaninka. And I'm going to just read a short excerpt from my journal before I continue with the presentation. So this is on my first day entering the community. The short ride takes us through a lush green mountain valley of rainforest agriculture, agroforestry and permaculture plots flanked by tree-covered mountainsides sparkling in the sun. The sounds of the town, revving engines, honking moto taxis, barking dogs, are replaced by a forest soundscape, singing birds, chirping insects, and a rustling canopy. An older man with an Italian accent is in the middle seat with 2 women and is smoking a brown resinous roach of an old spliff with a soporific smile. Musica, he yells, imploring the driver to turn on the radio. I crack the window and stare outside at the breathtaking landscape, pulling out my camera for the first time to snap some photos. The leaves of everything seem to be growing bigger as we get further from Oxapampa. Open spaces seem to expand and contract at the same time as the road is encroached by denser forest, being cut straight through by a rocky stream bed, which the van lurches across. And verdant pockets open up on either side of coffee and banana plots in the shade of evergreen timber species and leguminous trees. This is a true mix of montane forest and Amazon rainforest, as if passing through an ecological zipper with coniferous trees meeting big-leaved lowland species in a strange, dissonant, liminal space, almost reflecting the meeting of different worlds this space represents, where the Yanesha, one of the oldest diverging branches of the Arawakan language family, who first domesticated yucca or manioc near Madre de Dios, which is now a staple crop for over 800 million people, have occupied an ancestral homeland between the lowland Amazon and the high Andes for at least several thousand years. Once a crossroads between the Incan Empire and the Amazon basin, they have survived the arrivals of Spanish missionaries and conquistadors, Austro-German colonists, and Andean migration. Here in the Chorobamba River Valley, where the sun rises over the Yanachaga Mountains, beyond which lies the Palcazú Basin, and sets behind the Central Andes, residents of Sechopen navigate the implications of a biosphere reserve where they share tidal communities with the Ashaninka and a growing tourist presence. The convergence of global and local economies, parallel forces of cultural and ecological erosion, external demand for a traditional appearance, and a local desire to recover foods and customs of their ancestors. So I'm always fascinated by the relationship between landscape and culture that I've come across during my fieldwork. With the Aneasha, I was astounded by how they inhabit a transitional space between the mountain and the jungle, being members of an Amazonian language group, yet having a lot of markers of Quechua and Andean culture. They've always occupied that kind of meeting place between ecological and cultural worlds. And I think this speaks to a larger picture of humanity itself in a period of transition as we try to reconcile post-humanist critiques and recent social science and environmental awareness with the world of ecological crises that modernity has produced. So this was one of my key informants, Ricardo, 72 years old. He was the former leader of the community that I was in. And I conducted several interviews with him over those months. And I'm really interested in how people in the Amazon are always in communication with the forest. So even while we were interviewing, this is what he called his office, his designated interview area. So we were sitting on these wooden stools that he had built, and he told me he charges $100 per hour for interviews. But at one point while we were talking, there was a chorus of citizen birds singing above us, and he paused and told me to listen to the little parrots. It's not always like this. It means that you're a good person, and he said that they only sing like that sometimes, and if bad people are coming through the village, they'll scream or they'll get upset and disappear, or you won't hear them at all. So he's lived through most of the deforestation of the valley, and in this community, there's no more living curanderos or shamans. They don't know how to make ayahuasca anymore, but they sing a song about ayahuasca at every ceremony, and one of my other friends was the leader of the dance group that sings, and they always sing this song about ayahuasca, and everybody gets really into it. And he told me the story about it, but they don't actually take ayahuasca in this community anymore. And he said if I wanted to, I had to go visit another community, the Namatsagenka, and that I shouldn't take ayahuasca if I'm seeking visions, only as medicine. So even though they don't take ayahuasca anymore, it still plays a role in their cosmology or their cultural perspective. And I think I'm going to quickly define ontology, which is what I really am getting at when I say cosmology. This is Eduardo, who's the leader of the dance group in the community. So ontology is a cultural perspective expressing ecological, social, and environmental relationships within a society. And it refers to different worlds as opposed to worldviews. The ontological world one inhabits ultimately reflects and transmits cultural values often connected to cosmovision. Aldous Huxley's friend Lynn White links this to environmental crises when he said, "What people do about their ecology depends on what they think about themselves in relations to the things around them, that is, by a religion." So our picture of the world and the feeling or state of being it engenders is intimately connected to the human-environment relationship that we see. Biocultural conservation is the idea that cultural diversity is connected to biological diversity. So if you protect one, you protect the other. and you can't really separate the two. So kicking native peoples out of a forest in order to protect it is actually counterproductive. Conservation is, in contrast to preservation, seeks the proper use of nature as opposed to protecting nature from use. So whatever sustainability one considers proper use will naturally correspond to one's relational perspective. In other words, to one's ontology. Anthropologist Tim Ingold writes about the idea of life as a narrative and actually quotes Martin Heidegger, which was shout out to the last talk. He said, unlike the animal in its captivation, which finds itself taken in an environmental embrace that is as passionate as it is overwhelming, the human being stands before the world as a domain of things in themselves and has of necessity to take a stance towards it. Ingold goes on to indicate that the stance one takes is an extension of the story one tells. In other words, your ontology. Thinking of the world in the image of a globe, according to Ingold, is actually, rather than connecting us, it's the culmination of a process of separation. The world is something we live in and not something that we look at from the outside. So how a society perceives the world results in certain policies and attitudes, hinting at this relationship expressed by anthropologist Gregory Bateson. The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. So the way people think is an extension of their ontology, and it's reflected in their language and the classification systems. Certain peoples, such as the Amazonian Avila Runa or the Ashaninka, differ from the Western manifestation of this relationship in what's called Perspectivism. And this is summarized by Eduardo Viegas de Castro as the view of the world as an ecology of subjective selves, where all living beings are subjective identities. In all of nature, everything is at its root a human person, and on the outside it appears differently to different beings in the biosphere. But it's essentially an animistic idea where everything is fundamentally a subject, which challenges the traditional subject-object, nature-culture, mind-body divides of Cartesian dualism. In achieving the aims of reductionist science, the state authorities which utilize this point of view, modernity's model of the world has culminated in an epoch marked by alienation. The power of this alternative perspectival view to decolonize thought and inform how we move forward in the Anthropocene is more pressing and prescient than ever. So, does everybody know what Anthropocene is? Or can anybody tell me? So it's a geological epoch proposed by several different thinkers. Dipesh Chakrabarty correlates the history of its emergence with a new kind of thinking underlying the human choices which caused the current epoch that we live in, and that you can actually observe it in stratigraphic data, that we're fundamentally changing the geological nature of the globe. And Eduardo Cohn, the author of How Forests Think, sees this as a consequence of something he calls symbolic thought run wild. Our obsession with symbolic thought and the world of symbols we've created is increasingly disconnected from reality, an amplification of a human tendency to separate ourselves from the world, made possible by social and technological developments, coupled with forms of thinking that go hand in hand with it. Another dimension of this new epoch is an epoch of thought. So it's intimately tied to symbolic overdrive, what Karl Marx called the metabolic rift. Social and ecological alienation from the resources by which we survive, in addition to the natural world which produces them. When symbolic constructions override sensory experience, they threaten to completely alienate us from reality, radically cutting us off from the world around us. I think reconnecting with that larger world could dramatically heal that separation. And a possible treatment for this disease of modernity, put forward by some anthropologists, is encompassed by what's called the ontological turn and multispecies ethnography. This is an attempt to bring that Amazonian perspectival view of nature as mind and subjects into modern scientific approaches. So, symbolic overdrive is characterized by a dominance of reductionism and fragmentation, resulting in a level of alienation from nature which facilitates a cascade of biocultural destruction underpinning climate change. Multispecies ethnography represents a path towards de-alienation and breaking the nature-culture dichotomy, and highlights some of the lessons we can learn from animistic thinking. This isn't claiming that Western scientists need to become animists, but animism itself is inherently subjectifying, situated as the polar opposite of the objectifying force of reductionism. The anthropology beyond the human, another way to put multispecies ethnography, views the forest as comprised of selves, related selves, and provides an antidote to the profound alienation which is the consequence of transforming relations into things and perceiving the world as a collection of detached objects. So there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance in the fact that there's a subjective source of knowledge in the Amazon, but it's used to create, for advancements in objective science. Pharmaceutical companies have developed a cornucopia of different medicines from plant-based remedies with Amazonian origins. The Convention on Biological Diversity tried to address the biopiracy concerns, but even intellectual property laws are kind of insufficient to protect cultural resources in most cases. The whole concept of turning plants into products is made possible in part by the alienating nature of modernism, which removes entities from their relational context and converts them into objects. So this is a picture of the first commercially available form of curare, which is a South American arrow poison, which revolutionized our understanding of neuromuscular function. It is a great example of how the widespread co-option and commercialization of Amazonian plants has changed our own science and culture, and kind of nowadays, I guess the most relevant example is ayahuasca, the ayahuasca ceremony itself. But more on the medicine side, biomedicine side, fully 75% of plant-based pharmaceutical products originate from traditional societies. This is the two ingredients in curare, Strychnos toxifera and Chronodendron tomentosum. So the fact that it takes like 72 hours to prepare and the vapors can kill you and it's such a complex process speaks to the medicinal and ecological knowledge of the communities which produce such medicines such as ayahuasca, another example of something very complex that Western science has to presume that trial and error over many years produced these medicines. But if you ask the shamans themselves, they attribute their knowledge to the plants and say that they were taught directly by the plants how to come up with these recipes. Simply stating that such people stumbled upon the knowledge kind of belies a much greater story and at least partially functions as an excuse to poach the knowledge and mismanage forest resources. Cosmology's contribution to indigenous knowledge is not only medicinal but also ecological. Religiously significant places tend to be higher in biodiversity. there's a correlation between traditional societies and biodiversity hotspots. There's a huge body of evidence supporting the fact that indigenous territories have more biodiversity than protected lands, and that these empirically effective management strategies and medicinal substances result from religious systems dependent on shamans who ingest visionary plants runs counter to mainstream scientific thought. If environmental practices are an extension of this ontological perspective, belief should indicate behavior. Clearly, the treatment of plants as subjects, an ontology shaped by ayahuasca-drinking practitioners, has a positive effect on biodiversity. Of course, this isn't always the case, but despite exceptions, examples abound of strict rules, religious rules that prevent overharvesting and impart an attitude of respect towards nature. The sort of modernist principles that the power structures of Western science operate on have made possible many of the business models of plant-based remedies. And the emergence of the Anthropocene narrative has revealed that this way of thinking belongs to an obsolete dichotomy that is as non-practical as it is non-scientific. The heuristic devices represented by the mind-body, nature-culture, and subject-object paradigms have in some ways run their course, and the decolonization of thought offered by the ontological turn is increasingly relevant to environmental concerns. Now, there's a danger in expecting indigenous peoples to provide the solutions to ecological crises that industrialized nations created while bearing the brunt of the consequences. And of course, this isn't an invitation for everybody to flock to the Amazon and take ayahuasca, but it's definitely changing the way that scientists are looking at new ways of knowing and ways of being. And it's still important not to treat indigenous people as unchanging monoliths without agency. In response to globalization and market pressures, indigenous societies are changing. This is my friend Eduardo showing off his organic coffee, but he was also very proud of his native crops and has a very passionate desire to recover lost varieties. Here's a quote from another Yanesha leader, kind of summarizing this position. Many criticize us and tell us that as Yanesha, we must not forget our custom and our culture, that we should live in our humble house, eating fish and wild animals. But will Yanesha live from that? Our coffee is now our black gold because it is the only one that gives us the economic means to survive. We are in the 21st century, and Yanesha is now able to be an entrepreneur. But this does not mean that we forget our identity. If a brother invites you to take manioc beer, you cannot refuse. You cannot be ashamed because it is part of our culture. The psychedelic idea of thinking forests or nature as mine provides a promising path to follow in response to the complexities of co-management. Like I said before, research has shown that larger community forests coupled with increased community ownership and autonomy yields higher carbon storage capacity and higher biodiversity than top-down centralized models of government land management. This points to the potential of a polycentric co-management approach which mirrors decentralized forest thinking as a system in contrast to central planning, which is a model modernity has constructed to mirror its conception of the body as controlled by the brain. It's tempting to imagine forests as human-like superorganisms, as plants clearly respond to their surroundings, store memories, and integrate information, activities which we call thought when a nervous system is involved. This intelligence is very different than the kind that we have. Author of the Songs of Trees, David Haskell, likens this intelligence to culture itself, stating that ideas and human culture happen between points of consciousness in our brain. It's very decentralized, but has memory and contributes to our understanding and our ability to solve problems. A relational perspective is an ecological one. It considers existence as a co-productive exercise. An ontology which allows for thinking forests and an anthropology beyond the human can recalibrate the way that we represent environmental relationships, which comes with a promise to reorient ethnobotanical perspectives across disciplines and their delineations. So what relevance does the idea of the world as mind, sorry, I don't know what's going on. This PowerPoint has a mind of its own, I think. How does this relate to objectively understanding the material world? The idea that science is purportedly objective kind of isn't the full truth, as science is heavily affected by repeated myths and stories. The religious-like authority that many Westerners give science forgets that reconsidering previous research is also a hallmark of science. All science rests on the admission that the scientist may be wrong, that another person using scientific methods can confirm or disprove previous research. Now, some may see this ontological idea as one side in a war of ideas raging between subjectivity and objectivity. But guided by their ayahuasqueros, the Amazonian Avila Runa frequently entertain viewpoints which capture multiple perspectives. In one myth, a man patching a leaky roof asks for his son-in-law to help by finding the leaks from the inside of the house, poking a stick through the holes, which are easy to see from the inside, but impossible to patch, and easy to patch from the outside, but hard to find. So the role of this anthropology beyond the human is to act as this stick, which aligns the inner perspective of non-human intelligence and Sylvan thought with that of the outer symbolic and human. If environmental problems are to be properly addressed, we must go beyond the human in order to grasp the larger picture. It's become apparent that all political problems are also ecological ones. So focus on beyond the human is called for in order to encapsulate the full image. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm sorry I don't have time for many questions or any. So thank you very much.